One fine afternoon a few weeks ago, I was listening to a Fresh Air on NPR, and the interview just drew me in right away. Terry Gross was interviewing a woman who had done something that was unusual and was very self-sacrificing. It cost her a lot of time. It exposed her to a lot of risk. She was literally putting her own life on the line in order to do this. And she did it for reasons of principle, for reasons of her own ideals and idealism. But what was so compelling to me about this interview, I was literally listening on the edge of my seat, was that her own mother hated the idea. And her mother hated the idea for reasons of her own principle, her own ideals and idealism. The daughter is named Rosa Brooks. And Rosa Brooks is a professor of law, a tenured professor of law at Georgetown in Washington, D.C. And one day she learns that the D.C. Police Department has this program, Police Academy for Civilians, where civilians can go to Police Academy. It's a lot. It's rigorous. It's evenings. It's weekends. It's hours and hours and hours and hours. But if you do the program, if you complete the rigorous ordeal of this Police Academy for Civilians program, at the end, you get a badge, a belt, a gun, and a uniform, and you get a partner, a seasoned partner, and together you do real police work, patrolling the streets of Washington, D.C. And in fact, Rosa Brooks does this program, completes it, and she's assigned with her partner the single most dangerous neighborhood in Washington, D.C. And of course, one wonders, why do this? She has this cushy job. She goes to Georgetown Law. She faces motivated law students who want to learn. Why would she leave cushy, safe life of the academy, put on the police person's blue uniform, and patrol the most dangerous streets in D.C.? And she writes a book about it, and she explains that she gets that police officers are a lightning rod in our society today. And she acknowledges and she names Eric Garner, she names Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Freddie Gray. These are all African Americans who died while they were in police custody. And she acknowledges the moral horror that each of those cases and so many others represent. And then she says, but I wanted to learn, what is it like to be a police officer from their point of view? If you're a police officer, what are you thinking about when you wake up in the morning and go about your day? And that is precisely where she met the most fierce resistance from her own mother, which I found so endlessly compelling. Her mother is Barbara Ehrenreich. So Barbara Ehrenreich is a very noted and richly published author. And not only is she a richly published author, she's also a very strong activist for her politics, but she also is a pioneer in a certain form of writing and journalism called immersive journalism. Here's what Barbara Ehrenreich does. She goes into a foreign world, a world not her own, and she lives it and she inhabits it fully from the inside, and then she writes about it. So, for example, one of Barbara Ehrenreich's classic books is called Nickel and Dimed. And what she does, Barbara Ehrenreich, she decides, how is it possible for Americans to live on minimum wage? If you make just a few dollars an hour, how do you buy what you need for life? How do you get housing and food and clothing and medical and dental, plus stuff like your car breaks down? How do you do that if you earn a few dollars an hour? And so she gets a job at Walmart, and she gets a job at Wendy's, and she cleans houses for Merry Maids, and she forces herself to live on what you earn with these minimum wage jobs, and she writes about it in nickel and dimed. And this is all part, by the way, of her progressive politics. Rosa Brooks writes that she grew up going to pickets and rallies. That's just what the family did. And in fact, Rosa Brooks is named for Rosa Parks. Barbara Ehrenreich literally named her daughter for a civil rights icon. So when Rosa Brooks tells her progressive mother, "Mom, I'm going to police academy," Barbara Ehrenreich has a very clear voice, and she shares it very clearly. She says to her daughter as follows. She says, "If you want to go to police academy and become a police officer so that you can infiltrate the police department and then write an expose about systemic racism that you encounter there, that I approve. But if you want to become a police officer, to actually do the work of being a police officer, then you have joined the enemy I loathe." L-O-A-T-H-E, that's her word. I loathe the idea. Now, I just found this so interesting, endlessly interesting. You have a daughter who's going to spend a lot of time and take a lot of risk to do this thing out of ideals and idealism, highly principled. And you have a mother who loathes the idea out of her ideals and idealism, out of her high principle. And I tell you this story today because Passover is 3 weeks from tonight. The first Seder is 3 weeks from tonight. And the Seder is, of course, the classic space in the Jewish world on the Jewish calendar, where people who love one another, where generations come together, and they talk about what matters. And because individuals are different, individual variability, and because generational perspectives are different, and because the issues that we face today are so complicated, the question arises, what kind of conversation are we going to have around our Seder table 3 weeks from tonight? Let me just give you one small example. There are literally 10,000 examples like this. That's an understatement. There are literally 100,000 examples like this. But I just want to give you one example just to think about the intersection of this kind of issue with our Seder table, with your Seder table 3 weeks from tonight. This week I was listening to a podcast, the New York Times, called After the Storm, which talked about what happened in Texas after that Valentine storm, which, as you know, just left broad swaths of Texas without power, without heat, without light, without connectivity, without Wi-Fi, and without running water. And we all read the articles that people were huddled in their homes and it was 25 degrees inside their home, and this is for days on end. And when the warmer weather had returned and some of the power had come back on, the daily podcast from the New York Times reporters go to Texas, and they want to see what's going on afterwards. And so they tell the story of 3 women of color. And the 3 women of color tell their stories of having homes that are no longer habitable. You can't live in these homes. In fact, one woman has 3 young sons, and it's so cold in her home, and it's also flooding in her home, that she literally, and they don't have money for a hotel, that they were given a bus, a heated bus, and her kids and her are there sleeping in a bus, in a chair, for nights on end. And the point of the podcast was that the severity of nature's wrath did not affect all citizens of Texas equally, that it was the communities of color, it was black and brown communities, that got hit first, that got hit hardest, and then the power came back that came back last. And the podcast raises the issue of justice and race and equity. That's a pervasive theme in our country, how the coronavirus had discrepant impacts on race, how the rollout is different based on race, and now how even nature herself has different impacts based on race and justice and equity. And as I was taking this in, I thought to myself, wow, This is one of the main issues in our country right now. Economic justice, racial justice. That is just a big issue. If you're alive and if you're reading the news and if you're connected to the world, you cannot duck this issue. It's just there, everywhere. And the question is, what's the intersection of that hard issue with your Seder table 3 weeks from tonight? And there's basically two answers to that question. One, and it's very tempting, it's like such a tempting, seductive alternative. I myself am deeply drawn to this first alternative, and that is to ignore all these issues entirely. Just don't talk about it. Why have an unpleasant, hard conversation? After all, if there were ever a season for an easy Seder, if there were ever a season for a no hot topics Seder, this would be the season. After all we've been through, we've ourselves have received, 10 plagues in real time in the past year. Maybe this is the year just to eat and to drink and to sing and to receive and give love and call it a day. And I kind of like that idea. There's only one problem with that idea and one cost to that idea. If we do the no hot topics Seder, if we studiously avoid talking about the issues that confront our country now, it's lovely and it's pleasant and it's easy. Nobody's blood pressure gets roiled. But here's the cost. And the cost came from an incredible piece of Torah that Jonathan Sacks wrote. He wrote it in his last book, Life-Changing Ideas, that he published right before he died. He wrote it about Parshat Akev in Deuteronomy, which talks a lot about Shema Yisrael, Im Tishma'u, if you listen to. He talked about hearing and listening. And this is the story he tells. He tells the story that 20 years ago, he initiated a conference in Judaism where the literati and glitterati of the Jewish world, the best thinkers and the best speakers, would come together to ponder the Jewish future. And he himself convened this forum, and people from lots of countries came. And then he writes, he attends the first day, and he attends a little bit of the second day, and then he and his wife leave the conference that he had initiated. And you read this and you think, wait a minute, how does a guy call for a conference and leave the conference that he calls? And his answer is very simple. Everybody was talking and nobody was listening. Everybody was talking past one another and nobody was listening to one another. And he just could not take the absence of listening. And so he writes about listening, and what he says is just so beautiful. I just love Jonathan Sacks' writing. I'm just going to quote it. It's just so gorgeous. He says as follows, so simple, so gorgeous. When we speak, we tell others who and what we are. But when we listen, we allow others to tell us who they are. And then he interprets Shema Yisrael not as hear, O Israel, or listen, Israel. He interprets Shema Yisrael as listen, really listen, because he says to really listen is an act of tzimtzum, it's an act of contraction. I have to make myself smaller to make room for you. It's not about me, it's about us, which means I want to hear about you, what makes you tick. And then he says that listening in that way is a deep gift, which brings us, it's a gift because you're taking an interest in the other person. And that brings us to the cost of a hot topic-free Seder. If you don't talk about anything that matters at the Seder, that's lovely, but here's the cost. He writes, hence the life-changing idea, listening is the greatest gift we can give to another human being. To be listened to be heard, is to know that someone else takes me seriously. That is a redemptive act. And the question I want to ask you to think about 3 weeks before the first Seder is, do you want the Seder that's easier without the redemptive act of listening? Or do you want the Seder that's harder, but with the redemptive act of listening generously to another person? That brings us to Rosa Brooks. So Rosa Brooks, despite her mother's objections, goes to police academy. She gets trained up. She gets her badge, her belt, her uniform, and she starts with her partner patrolling the streets. And the more she works as a police officer, the more complicated the reality of being a police officer becomes. And she realizes that there are two principles that are in constant tension with one another for every police officer. And each of these principles is true, and they just constantly bump up against one another. On the one hand, every police officer she meets is there, and they get this and they internalize this, that their mission is to protect and defend. Protect and defend. And that means, and they get and they internalize this, that they're supposed to be reserved and cautious and humble with the use of power and with the use of force. They get this, that is real. And here's the other principle. Every police officer gets, and they see it, and they're trained to see it, and they experience it, that on any given day, any person they meet on any street in their beat could kill them. She talks about when she goes to police academy, they have to watch hours and hours of heartbreaking video of officers who are shot and killed in the line of duty. And the instructor at the police academy will say, what could this police officer have done any different to still be alive and to still be there for their family? Any person, any day could kill you, and therefore, watch the hands, watch the hands. It's always the hands that can kill you. And she writes, as she lives with these two truths in her head, she just sees them bumping up against each other in every encounter she has with every officer she has. Protect and defend, yes. Humble and reserved with power, yes. And any person, any day could kill me. Watch the hands, watch the hands. As a result of all this complexity, she calls her book Tangled Up in Blue. She's just tangled up. She's tangled up in the complexity of officers who want to serve and defend and protect, and she's tangled up in officers who are reasonably concerned for their own lives. That kind of complexity does not make for the expose that her mother wanted her to write. But that kind of complexity is what you get when you listen, really listen, to the world, the worries, the woes, the wonder of somebody else. Can we do that? Pesach is coming, and there's a lot to talk about, and it is hard to talk about it. Do we want to listen, really listen to one another? Shabbat Shalom.